Hey y'all. Thanks so much for inviting me to join this meeting. I'm just amazed that there's 115 comrades that's on this call, and we've been having calls with other branches all across the country and other leftist solidarity groups across the world. And it's amazing, again, I think as socialists, to see that the uprising and developments that's happening here is not occurring in isolation. And it's just been beautiful to see. So thank you all for inviting me tonight. I think first I just want to lay some context as to lay some groundwork of the landscape, the social political landscape of Minneapolis first. So some things to keep in mind. Minneapolis, as of 2019, was ranked as #1 in the country as having the worst racial and economic disparities in the country. This comes before Mississippi, Alabama, any southern state where you've known a rich history of racial apartheid. We outbeat those states. And that is every socioeconomic marker. Black and brown folks in housing and income and wealth disparities and health disparities, we ranked at the top of having here in Minneapolis. And in some ways, it's kind of a tale of two cities. While we have this reality of racial and economic oppression for Black and brown and immigrant folks here, we are also constantly ranked as being one of the top cities for new professionals, for corporations to come to. It's depicted as having a vibrant job market, affordable housing market. It's the place to be. And to contextualize, it's the place to be if you're white, if you're middle class, and if you're affluent. So we have these two stark realities that have coexisted in Minneapolis for decades. And in that reality, where you have a racial economic apartheid apparatus existing, again, that means wealth, that means stability, that means comfort for the white, affluent, and middle class and corporate leaders and business leaders in our city. And then on the other hand, you have a massive reign of terror on a day-to-day basis, escalated and initiated from our local Minneapolis Police Department. And in that has resulted in numerous deaths before George Floyd. In 2017, we were having the same protests for Philando Castile, whose murder was also captured on video. And yet, in despite of the massive protests that happened across the country that were also largely peaceful, we saw the acquittal of the officers that were involved in his murder. In 2015, we had the murder of Jamar Clark by MPD. Also, video footage was shown of his death and his murder. And again, that prompted a local uprising of mostly our then present and vibrant Black Lives Matter movement. They led an 18-day occupation outside of the 4th Precinct police station. And all that, again, yielded no convictions, no charges for all of the officers involved. And this is also including white supremacists, because I will highlight this a little bit later. We had white supremacists because this protest was largely concentrated in North Minneapolis, which is a historical Black and brown community. We had white supremacists come to that action and shoot several of the protesters. And neither one of those white supremacists got petty misdemeanor charges for gravely injuring 2 peaceful protesters. And there's numerous cases where Black men and Black women have fallen prey to the police state in the city. And that's all coupled with a harsh economic reality for Black and brown folks who are largely relegated to the retail and fast food chains. They're barely earning $30,000 on an annual basis in the city, even though the city of Minneapolis recommend that the median income that anyone should have in order to lead a quality life in the city is about $80,000. So again, you have these two worlds that coexist in this space. And for a number of decades, Black and brown folks have had to suffer at the hands of the state of being economically repressed, of not having their civil liberties and rights be honored. And then on top of that, having to constantly deal with the day-to-day terrors of our local police state. So this last Monday really was a tipping point where once again, we had a Black man going on about his day. This Black man was George Floyd, went to his local neighborhood grocery store, Cups Food, to buy some groceries. And as a result of exchanging a counterfeit $20 bill, had the cops called on him. And as he was coming out, the cops pull up on him and brutally force him to the ground, and then have a knee placed in the back of his neck that essentially led to his asphyxiation. And then right immediately, mind you, dozens of community members are recording these moments of George's life being taken from him. And you see the murder taking place. And then after George is then put in the ambulance, the media reports that he dies from medical distress. And that already set a foundation for a pattern that Black and brown folks are very familiar with here in Minneapolis. That led us to believe these folks are not going to be held accountable. We're going to see a non-conviction. We're going to see a non-indictment once again. And as per usual, our existing civil rights group called a massive protest at the site of the murder. It pulled in 20,000 folks from all across the state. It's amongst the largest anti-police brutality march or protest I think that has ever happened in Minnesota, let alone this country. And as we all marched from the site of the murder to the 3rd precinct police station where the two cops involved in the murder worked, it became very clear that the energy was different in this space. And by the time we got to the police station, the youth, Black and brown youth, working class youth, took over. And this is a substantial development. I think DSA, the Twin Cities DSA branch, is really paying attention to in terms of the weaknesses that's showing amongst the different classes within our community. Immediately when the youth took over the police precinct and basically oust the civil rights groups from trying to manage and control what was happening there. That led to the escalation of youth basically directing anger and frustrations at the actual physical building. People bust the windows, they flipped over cop cars, and we're leading an actual assault on the physical police structure. And of course, in response, because our city elected leaders, as well as our overall political class, has been very intentional to bloat the budget of our police departments all across this country. The police, in response, had a budget to get prepped in riot gear, to have military convoys come out on the streets, to start tear gassing and shooting rubber bullets and flash grenades at largely peaceful protesters, or even protesters who weren't armed. They were throwing rocks at a building. We had that lethal response immediately from the police state. And time again, there was, over the past of the first 48 hours, this exchange of energy where, again, protesters were coming all from across the city, protesting peacefully there. And then the police would initiate by firing tear gas and all these weapons into the crowd. And that eventually prompted an escalation on the crowd to ripple that energy that was channeled towards that police station all across Minneapolis. And when I say that, that is when the lootings and the fires took place. And I should be very clear that the first wave of businesses to be hit was actually a Target corporation across the street from us, which has been largely known to partner with the MPD to bring in new forms of surveillance to keep up to date on how to surveillance and incarcerate shopkeepers, which have disproportionately been working class Black and brown folks. Target has also been met with numerous wage theft lawsuits in the recent years by a couple of worker rights groups here for stealing their workers' wages, which again are largely hourly Black and brown employees. So most of the waves of lootings was targeted towards large corporate chains, and that's not to say that this was a focus of those on the ground. But I want to highlight that because it's important that they were impacted, and why we should not, I think as socialists, buy into this narrative that looting is destructive when we have corporate chains that's constantly looting our labor and extracting resources through evasions of property taxes that then doesn't allow investments into our public infrastructure. That is the day-to-day looting process that working class people are never given a chance to reconcile in their communities. So I want to be clear to highlight that in addition to the small businesses and minority-owned businesses that were hit, large banks were hit. People were taking ATMs out of US Bank and Wells Fargo. Like, a lot of corporate chains were hit in the process. And something else to highlight is when this happened, the political class was confused as fuck. They didn't know how to respond. So they did the typical. They brought back the civil rights groups to say, hey, can you keep your Negroes under control? Can you do some peace healing events out there? Do what you need to do. And I literally sat in on one of these meetings where the Black folks were calling up the chief of police, and he justified to them that the reason why they were using lethal force against Black and brown peaceful protesters was because these protesters were co-opting their peaceful movement. And we saw civil rights groups at the discretion of the state, as well as the police, buy into this narrative and try to act based off of that. They also tried to bring in labor groups. Labor, we should not be confused at all that we have a labor movement that's still deeply entrenched with a Democratic Party that's beholden to the big business class. And as a result, they end up becoming a tool a managerial tool of the working class to manage the frustrations and anxieties of working class people, rank and file members. And all this to say, a core component of the responsibilities of the managerial class is to subdue any uprisings amongst Black and brown folks, of immigrants, of all folks that's been impacted by colonial past or any type of racist systems. They are there to subdue it, and they are then there to posit themselves as being actors and representatives on our behalf to lobby for mediocre and bare minimum reforms that do nothing to dismantle the state apparatus or to dismantle racialized capitalism. So you had all those actors coming in within the span of 48 hours, and then they realized they couldn't do anything. They couldn't do anything. So they had to spin a larger narrative. They had to say, look, community, we need to really, stop what's happening on the ground. And the reason why is because it's not us that's, looting businesses and setting fires and doing all these destructive things. It's outside agitators. It's white supremacists that's coming in and doing these things. So you all need to abide by our rules. And this is the state trying to reinstate law and order as what they're supposed to do and what they are going to do. So they're going to set aside a curfew to say, we will protect you now because we now know there's good folks on the ground and it's the bad folks. And if you all, the good folks, abide by this curfew, then that allows us to protect you and capture the bad folks, which is the white supremacists and the outside provocateurs and instigators that's doing all this destructive activities across the city. So we had large segments of our community buying into that. All across social media, folks were saying, get your ass in the house by 8 o'clock. People was making songs about it like, no, we need to abide by the state rules. This will protect us from outside forces that do not have our best interests. And immediately 24 hours after that curfew was set, there was a video shown of a residential block where there was I guess it was a couple or two residents were outside on their porch chilling. Mind you, they're still abiding by the curfew. They're on their private property chilling. And there's a military tank convoy coming down, again, this residential block. And there's cops coming with them ahead of this tank, and they throw a flash grenade at the family on the porch. So it's like, wait, those weren't white supremacists. Those weren't outside agitators. Those people were chilling in their homes. And then we saw a news report, a mainstream news report that came out that all the arrests that were made that night were not people from outside of Minnesota. They were all local folks. So I think that initially alerted our public of, shit, we got tricked. This is our own people that's on the ground, peaceful protesters who are being raptured by the state. And the state is using this false narrative to try to authorize how to frame it, to authorize not only lethal force, because they were already doing this, but deadly force amongst the police state that was already on the ground. But it gave them further justification to take President Trump on his offer of bringing in other military forces to Minneapolis to try to manage the situation and subdue that uprising. So that gave Governor Walz the okay to say, yeah, Trump, I think we might need the National Guards because these folks ain't stopping at this point. So once folks really realized, like, oh, the state is not protecting us, because mind you, while the police is out here patrolling with tanks, fires are still being set, and particularly in North Minneapolis, again, which is a historically working class Black and brown community. There were, I do not want to undermine this because this is a community that's still dealing with this at this current moment. There were white supremacists that were coming in and burning down businesses. And when they called the police, no one showed up. This was the case in even South Minneapolis, which is a progressive, typically white middle-class community. There was a fire set of a building across a gas station that was burning for hours. And several other residents, because surrounding that area is mostly Latinx residents, called the police and the fire department, and no one showed up. So in these moments, communities, working class people were putting two and two together to realize, oh, we might have to protect ourselves. And in response to that, we're setting up community defense committees, calling everyone in their communities to meet up at parks, kind of like a general assembly that we saw play out in 2011 with the Occupy Wall Street. We've seen massive mobilizations from communities to create community defense committees. We've also seen mutual aid projects like the one DSA have led to create food relief sites, because a lot of the grocery chains that provided accessible food goods or groceries have been closed. So working class people don't have access to that anymore. We've set up ground medical stations because all the hospitals coming off of COVID have been short-staffed. And also on the ground, police will not let ambulances or any healthcare workers come to the scene when protesters are being injured. So we're seeing this massive shift of how the community is taking ownership and taking care of themselves, in light that the political class is not here to protect them and has failed them massively in this time of this uprising, and even during the COVID pandemic. So it presents a really amazing opportunity, I think, as a socialist organization, for us to really consider how to take these efforts, these developments that's taking place on the ground, where we're seeing working class communities start to interrogate their relationship with racial capitalist system, as well as their attachment to the political class, specifically the Democratic Party. They're having these realizations that these systems are not designed to meet their interests, nor to protect them. How as socialists, we can start to pivot and really meet working class folks where they are, to start organizing within the public labor sectors, to start bringing rank and file members into our ranks, all with the goal of guiding working class folks away from the old approach or the old practice of, we have these uprisings, and then again, we have the political or the managerial class come in and basically say, we got you, we'll negotiate with the state on your behalf. And then things go back to usual. We end up saving the same racial capitalist system that put us in these predicaments to begin with, for these uprisings to happen, and for the constant annihilation of Black and brown lives to happen, for the constant exploitation of working class folks' labor and Black and brown folks' labor. We end up saving those systems again. And this is a pivotal moment. This Minneapolis uprising is a pivotal moment for DSA, I think locally here in the Twin Cities as well as nationally, to really start pivoting and working with working class folks to figure out what it looks like to go towards something new, to not save what abuses, exploits, and kills us, to really start building and to use the things that we're doing around the mutual aid efforts, the community defenses, to build their confidence, to show that we are making a transitional effort in this moment towards something new. And we just had a victory today where our public schools, the board voted to sever their contract with the police department. The University of Minnesota also led that, and now it set a tone for our teachers union where I work to start considering how do we drag the larger teacher movement after they've basically helped reinvigorize the labor movement through strikes all across this country. How can we bring them into such a core piece of the anti-racist movement? So it presents a plethora of opportunities that as socialists, we need to be a part of, and making sure we're building towards a socialist vision and a socialist reality, some of which is built upon the populist agenda that Bernie Sanders galvanized around, that probably brought a lot of us to this branch into this organization. And we need to continue doing that work on the ground with working class people wherever they're at, because I tell you all, we cannot allow the working class folks to go back to the system that we know that doesn't work. We cannot save it, and nor should we. And we should show working class people that they have the ability to do something different and have to do something different.